The basement is more than enough for someone your age. My daughter-in-law said the same night I finished paying for their dream house. My son just stood there beside her, staring at the hardwood floor like he suddenly found it fascinating. I smiled softly, carried my last suitcase downstairs, and said nothing. What they didn't know was that I still had every bank transfer receipt, every signed agreement, every promise they thought I'd forgotten. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The first time I saw the house, I cried. Not because it was grand or luxurious, though it certainly looked that way to someone like me. The white brick exterior gleamed under the Texas sun, and the front porch wrapped around the entire house like something out of a magazine. There were 6 bedrooms, tall arched windows, and a backyard large enough for my future grandchildren to run through barefoot during summer barbecues. After losing my husband, Frank, 3 years earlier, I never thought I'd feel excitement like that again. But standing there beside my son Ethan that afternoon, hearing him say, "Mom, this could finally be our forever home," made something warm flicker back to life inside me. Family. That dangerous little word. At 68 years old, family was all I had left. Frank and I had spent 42 years building a modest life together in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He worked as a mechanic until arthritis bent his hands so badly he could barely grip a wrench anymore. I worked part-time at a library and spent decades stretching every dollar until it screamed. We weren't wealthy people, but we were careful. When Frank passed away from a stroke, he left behind 2 things: a small life insurance policy and the old brick house we'd spent 30 years paying off. I thought I would die in that house too. Then Ethan called me one rainy Thursday evening. "Mom," he'd said gently, "you shouldn't be alone anymore." At the time, those words sounded loving. Now I understand they were strategic. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the cordless phone pressed to my ear while rain tapped softly against the windows. "You've done enough for everyone else," Ethan continued. "Let us take care of you now. Let us," meaning him and his wife, Vanessa. Vanessa always knew how to sound sweet when she wanted something. "Oh, Martha," she used to say, placing a manicured hand dramatically over her chest. "You're the glue holding this family together." At first, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. When you're an older woman living alone, loneliness can make even small kindnesses feel enormous. A month later, they flew to Tulsa to visit me. Vanessa brought flowers. Ethan hugged me longer than usual. And together, they painted a beautiful picture of our future. "We found this incredible property outside Dallas," Vanessa explained excitedly over dinner. "Big enough for all of us. You'd have your own space," Ethan added quickly. "No more worrying about bills or mowing lawns or icy driveways." I remember laughing softly. "I'm not helpless yet." "Of course not," Vanessa said smoothly. "But family should live together. Especially now." Now. Another dangerous word. Now that I was widowed. Now that I was aging. Now that I had money sitting inside a paid-off house. At the time, I only heard concern. I didn't hear opportunity. Over the next several weeks, they called constantly. Photos of the new house arrived almost daily. The gourmet kitchen with marble countertops. The enormous stone fireplace. The upstairs guest suite they claimed would be perfect for me. Vanessa even sent Pinterest boards asking what color curtains I liked. For the first time since Frank died, I felt needed again. That feeling can blind a person. I sold my house that winter. Packing 42 years of memories into cardboard boxes nearly broke me. Frank's fishing gear. The old coffee mug he used every morning. The faded Christmas ornaments our son made in elementary school. I stood in that empty living room the night before closing and cried so hard my chest hurt. But I kept telling myself it was worth it. I wasn't losing a home. I was gaining a family again. The sale brought in more money than I expected. Housing prices had climbed over the years, and after fees and taxes, I walked away. With nearly $400,000. More money than I had ever seen in my entire life. Ethan insisted we meet with their mortgage broker immediately. "It'll make everything easier if we move quickly," he explained. Vanessa nodded sympathetically beside him. "And we want you comfortable before next winter." The paperwork confused me at times. So many signatures. So many forms. But Ethan always sounded patient when he explained things. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd say. "This is just standard procedure." I trusted him. He was my son. The little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who cried after his first heartbreak. the young man Frank taught to shave in our upstairs bathroom. I never imagined that same boy could one day watch his wife humiliate me and stay silent. Moving day arrived in early spring. I still remember how proud Ethan looked carrying boxes into the new house. Vanessa stood in the foyer directing movers like she owned a palace. "This is the start of something wonderful," she kept saying. And for a little while, I believed her. The first week felt almost magical. We ate dinner together every evening. Vanessa asked for my recipes. Ethan insisted I choose flowers for the backyard garden. They even cleared a beautiful upstairs bedroom for me, overlooking the trees. I unpacked carefully, arranging framed family photos along the dresser. One picture showed Ethan at age 7 holding a fish beside Frank at Lake Texoma. Another captured our last Christmas together before cancer took Frank's younger brother. I remember staring at those photos and whispering softly, "We made it, Frank." I thought the hardest years were finally behind me. Then little things began changing. At first, they were easy to ignore. Vanessa started referring to my room as the guest room. Then she suggested I keep most of my belongings in storage to reduce clutter. Soon after that, she began making comments that sounded harmless on the surface. "You know," she said one afternoon while unloading groceries, "stairs can become dangerous at your age." At your age? I pretended not to notice how often she repeated those words. One evening, I came downstairs to find them whispering at the kitchen island. The conversation stopped immediately when they saw me. Vanessa smiled too quickly. Ethan suddenly became fascinated with his phone. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Still, I said nothing. Older women are taught to endure discomfort quietly. We smooth tension over. We excuse bad behavior. We convince ourselves we're imagining things. A few days later, Vanessa knocked gently on my bedroom door. She stood there wearing yoga clothes and an expression so carefully sympathetic it almost impressed me. "Martha," she began softly, "we've been thinking." My heart sank instantly. Nobody ever says we've been thinking before delivering good news. "The upstairs layout just isn't practical anymore," she continued. "Especially with the baby plans." "Baby plans," I repeated. Ethan appeared behind her then, hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. "We've been trying," he admitted quietly. For a brief moment, joy pushed away my unease. "A grandchild? Frank would have loved that." "That's wonderful," I said honestly. Vanessa smiled tightly. "Yes, and we really need more room upstairs if we're starting a family." I looked between them slowly. Something inside me already knew where this conversation was heading. "There's a fully renovated basement suite," Vanessa continued. "It's actually very cozy." Cozy. Another dangerous word. I stared at her. "The basement. It would honestly be safer," she said quickly. "Less stairs. More privacy for everyone." Privacy. As though my existence upstairs somehow disturbed the natural order of their lives. I turned toward Ethan. My son. The child I carried for 9 exhausting months. The boy whose fevers I sat beside through endless nights. The man I had just helped buy $1 million house. Surely he would say something. Surely he would remember whose money made those walls possible. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly and muttered, "It does make sense, Mom." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like old wood splitting beneath too much weight. Still, I nodded. Because women my age learn early that dignity sometimes means surviving humiliation without an audience. "I see," I said softly. Vanessa immediately brightened. "Wonderful. I already had the basement painted in warmer colors." Already, meaning the decision had been made long before this conversation. That night, I carried one suitcase downstairs by myself. The basement was finished beautifully, I'll give them that. Gray walls, small kitchenette, tiny bathroom with polished fixtures. It looked less like part of a home and more like somewhere people placed relatives they didn't truly want around. A retirement waiting room. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the low ceiling for a very long time. Above me, I could hear laughter, footsteps, cabinet doors opening and closing. Life continuing upstairs without me. Then my phone buzzed. A fraud alert from my bank. I frowned and adjusted my glasses. There had been a large transfer inquiry connected to the house account earlier that afternoon. Requested ownership review. My chest tightened slowly. Ownership review? I stared at the screen while a strange feeling crawled up my spine. For the first time since moving into that house, I asked myself a question I should have asked months earlier. Exactly whose house was this? I barely slept that night. The basement felt colder after midnight, though the thermostat on the wall claimed it was 72 degrees. I lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling while the sound of footsteps moved faintly above me. Their footsteps. Their life. Their house. No, not their house, I reminded myself silently. At least, I hope not. The fraud alert from my bank sat unanswered on my phone screen beside the bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words again. Requested ownership review. Around 2 in the morning, I finally got up and made myself a cup of tea in the little basement kitchenette. The cabinets still smelled like fresh paint. Vanessa probably considered that thoughtful. A modern basement for the aging mother. A comfortable little corner where I could stay out of sight without technically being abandoned. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and sat at the tiny table near the window well. Outside, only a sliver of moonlight was visible through the glass. For the first time since moving to Texas, I felt truly alone. Not widow alone. That kind of loneliness I already understood. This was different. This was the loneliness of realizing you might have been strategically removed from your own place in the family. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. People my age do that often. We explain away disrespect because admitting the truth hurts too much. Maybe the ownership review was routine. Maybe Vanessa genuinely believed the basement would be easier for me. Maybe Ethan was simply stressed about work and starting a family. I repeated those lies to myself while making coffee upstairs at 6:30. Vanessa entered the kitchen 20 minutes later wearing silk pajamas and a fitness tracker on her wrist. She stopped when she saw me standing near the espresso machine. "Oh," she said lightly. "You're up early." I've always been an early riser. She opened the refrigerator and began taking out fruit containers without looking at me. For a moment, the silence between us felt strangely formal, like two polite strangers sharing an Airbnb kitchen. Then her eyes drifted toward the folder in my hands. The house documents. I'd pulled them from my suitcase after barely sleeping. "You're not worrying about paperwork, are you?" she asked with a soft laugh. "Ethan handles all that complicated stuff." There was something in her tone that bothered me. Not concern. Dismissal. I smiled faintly. "Your father always taught me to keep copies of important things." "Well," she said, shutting the refrigerator a little too hard. "That's probably unnecessary now." Now. Again that word. Before I could answer, Ethan walked in adjusting his tie. "Morning, Mom." He kissed Vanessa on the cheek first. Then he poured himself coffee without noticing the exhaustion on my face. I studied him quietly. Sometimes I tried to find traces of the little boy he used to be, but adulthood had changed him in subtle ways. The softness Frank loved so much in him had hardened over the years into something more practical, more convenient. "Ethan," I said carefully, "I received a strange fraud notification from the bank last night." That got his attention immediately. His hand froze around the coffee mug. Vanessa looked down at the counter too quickly. "What kind of notification?" he asked. "Something about an ownership review connected to the house." A pause. Just a second or two, but long enough. Then Vanessa laughed softly. "Oh my goodness, that's probably from refinancing discussions." "Refinancing," I repeated. Ethan cleared his throat. "We've been exploring options to lower the monthly payments." "We." Interesting word considering nearly 70% of the down payment came from me. I looked at my son for a long moment. Without mentioning it to me, his expression tightened slightly. "Mom, you don't need to stress about financial details anymore." There it was again. That subtle push. The gentle little reminders that I was old now. Fragile. Replaceable. I nodded slowly and lowered my eyes to my coffee cup. But inside, something had changed during the night. I was done being handled. And later that afternoon, while Vanessa was out shopping and Ethan was at work, I made a quiet phone call to the one person Frank always trusted more than anyone else with money. His old attorney, Daniel Mercer. And what he told me an hour later made my blood run cold. Daniel Mercer answered on the second ring. "Martha," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Well, this is a voice I haven't heard in a while." Hearing his voice almost made me cry. Daniel had handled Frank's paperwork for years. Wills, taxes, insurance claims. The kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards and wore the same brown loafers every day of his life. If Frank trusted anyone, it was Daniel. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said quietly. "You could never bother me. What's wrong?" For a moment, I almost lied. Almost told him everything was fine. That instinct runs deep in women my generation. Protect the family. Keep problems private. Don't embarrass your children. But something inside me was too tired to pretend anymore. So I told him everything. The house. The money. The basement. The ownership review notification from the bank. Daniel stayed silent for several seconds after I finished speaking. Finally, he asked carefully, "Martha, whose names are actually on the deed?" My stomach tightened. I assumed Ethan and Vanessa added me. A pause. "Martha," he said gently. "Assuming and signing are two very different things." An hour later, I drove to his office alone. The Texas heat pressed heavily against the windshield while my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My chest felt strange the entire drive. Not panic exactly. Dread. Like some part of me already knew what I was about to hear. Daniel's office looked exactly the same as it had 10 years earlier. Shelves full of legal books. A coffee machine older than most marriages. Framed photos of his grandchildren lining the walls. He greeted me softly and motioned toward a chair. Then he opened the file I'd emailed him earlier that afternoon. For several minutes, he read quietly while adjusting his glasses lower on his nose. The silence nearly killed me. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "Martha," he said carefully, "you transferred $380,000 into this purchase." "Yes. And according to these documents, the property deed lists only Ethan and Vanessa as legal owners." I stared at him. At first, the words didn't even make sense. Only Ethan and Vanessa. "No," I whispered automatically. "That can't be right." Daniel slid the copy of the deed toward me. There it was. Their names. Not mine. Not even partially. Nothing. My vision blurred for a moment. "I don't understand," I said weakly. "Ethan told me we were buying the house together." Daniel's expression softened with something dangerously close to pity. "What you signed," he explained carefully, "was classified as a gift contribution toward the purchase." Gift contribution. I actually laughed. A small, broken sound that didn't even feel human. Nearly $400,000. My entire life savings. The money Frank and I spent 4 decades building together. A gift. I looked down at my trembling hands. Suddenly the basement made perfect sense. The quiet disrespect. The secrecy. The sudden discussions about privacy. They hadn't moved me downstairs because of stairs. They moved me because the transaction was complete. Daniel leaned forward gently. "Did they pressure you during signing?" I trusted my son. The moment those words left my mouth, I felt humiliation burn through me hotter than anger. Not because I was old, because I had been foolish. Daniel remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. "There's something else you need to know." My heart sank even lower. "The ownership review notification," he said carefully. "It appears they've recently explored using the property as collateral." I frowned. Collateral for what? He hesitated. Then he turned the monitor toward me. "Home equity loan inquiry. Large amount requested." My blood turned cold. They weren't just trying to push me out of the house. They were trying to borrow against the house I paid for. And suddenly, for the first time since Frank died, I stopped feeling like a grieving mother and started feeling like a woman who had been professionally deceived by her own family. I sat in Daniel Mercer's office long after he stopped talking. Outside his window, traffic moved slowly through the late afternoon heat. But inside that little office, everything felt strangely still. Like time itself had paused just long enough for my entire life to split into 2 parts. The woman I had been before today, and the woman sitting there now. Daniel eventually folded his hands on the desk and spoke carefully. "Martha, I need to ask you something difficult." I nodded faintly. "Did Ethan ever directly tell you your name was on the deed?" The question hit harder than I expected, because the answer was no. Not exactly. I closed my eyes briefly, replaying months of conversations in my head. "We're buying this house together. You'll always have a home with us. This is for the family." Careful words. Safe words. Words designed to let me assume things without ever technically lying. A cold ache spread through my chest. Daniel seemed to understand immediately. "They were very deliberate," he said quietly. I stared down at the paperwork again. Gift contribution. I hated those words more every second. Not investment. Not shared ownership. A gift. As though Frank and I spent 40 years sacrificing just so someone else could eventually inherit the reward. Daniel gently pushed another document toward me. This was filed 2 weeks ago. I looked down. Preliminary refinancing inquiry. Estimated available equity, substantial. Vanessa and Ethan hadn't even waited 6 months before trying to leverage the house financially. My house. Or at least the house my money built. They're planning something, I whispered. Daniel didn't answer immediately, but he didn't need to. I could already see it now. The basement. The distancing. The constant reminders about my age. They weren't preparing space for a baby. They were preparing space without me. I suddenly remembered something Vanessa had said the previous week while decorating the upstairs hallway. This home really represents the future we deserve. At the time, I thought she meant family. Now I understood what she actually meant. Ownership. Control. Freedom from the burden of the old woman downstairs. I swallowed hard and looked at Daniel. Do I have any rights at all? He leaned back slowly. That depends on what can be proven. The lawyer in him had returned now. Calm. Careful. Precise. If there were verbal promises, written communications, financial records, or evidence you were intentionally misled, there may still be options. Options. Such a small word for something that suddenly meant survival. I nodded slowly. Then another painful thought entered my mind. Frank warned me once, I said quietly. Daniel looked up. A few years before he died, he told me never to hand over everything at once. He said dependence changes family dynamics. A sad smile crossed Daniel's face. Frank was a smart man. Yes, I whispered. And I didn't listen. The drive home felt different that evening. Not because the roads had changed. Because I had. When I pulled into the driveway, the house no longer looked warm or welcoming. The white brick exterior suddenly felt cold. Performative. Like a luxury hotel pretending to be a family home. Vanessa's SUV sat parked beside Ethan's truck. I remained in my car for nearly 5 minutes before going inside. I needed time to put my face back together. Older women learn that skill eventually. How to cry without swollen eyes. How to smile while grieving. How to survive humiliation quietly enough that nobody feels uncomfortable. The moment I entered through the garage door, I heard laughter upstairs. Vanessa was entertaining guests. I climbed halfway up the stairs before stopping. 2 women stood in the kitchen drinking wine, while Vanessa leaned casually against the marble counter. I swear, she laughed. Having his mom downstairs actually solved everything. The women chuckled politely. My hand tightened around the railing. One of them asked, "Is she staying permanently?" Vanessa shrugged. "For now. But Ethan and I have been discussing long-term care communities eventually." Long-term care communities. Such polite words. That's how people like Vanessa talked about removing someone from their life without sounding cruel. I stood frozen in silence while my daughter-in-law sipped wine in the kitchen I helped pay for. Then she laughed softly again and said the sentence I will never forget for the rest of my life. Honestly, once the refinancing goes through, things will get much easier. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. They weren't just using me. They had already built their future around the assumption that I was too weak to stop them. That night, I stayed downstairs. I didn't confront Vanessa. I didn't slam doors or cry or demand explanations. At my age, you learn something important about betrayal. The louder you react, the faster dishonest people turn you into the problem. So I became quiet instead. Very quiet. I heated canned soup in the little basement kitchenette and listened to the muffled sounds of laughter upstairs. Glasses clinking, cabinet doors opening and closing. Vanessa's bright social voice floating faintly through the vents. The whole house felt divided now. Their world above, mine below. And for the first time, I understood that division hadn't happened accidentally. I barely touched my food. Instead, I sat at the small table with Daniel's printed copies spread out in front of me. The deed, the bank inquiry, the transaction history showing every wire transfer from my account. Nearly $400,000. Frank would have been devastated. Not because of the money, because of Ethan. Frank worshipped that boy. Even after Ethan became an adult, Frank still talked about him like he hung the moon. Every little league game, every graduation, every birthday fishing trip. I suddenly remembered something from years ago. Ethan had been 16 when he wrecked Frank's pickup truck sneaking out one night. I'd been furious, but Frank only sighed and said, "Kids make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn integrity afterward." Sitting there alone in that basement, I realized something painful. Maybe Ethan never learned it. Around 9 o'clock, footsteps moved overhead, then slowly descended the basement stairs. I gathered the papers calmly before Vanessa appeared in the doorway. "There you are," she said lightly, glancing around the room. "You disappeared after dinner." I smiled faintly. I wasn't very hungry. She crossed her arms loosely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her eyes landed briefly on the documents beside me. Something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Awareness. You know, she said casually. Ethan worries about you stressing too much over finances. There it was again. That careful tone people use when speaking to someone they've already decided is fragile. I've managed finances my entire adult life, I replied softly. Vanessa laughed gently. Of course. I just mean, things are complicated nowadays. Complicated. Interesting choice of word for stealing someone's security. She stepped farther into the room, glancing around the basement suite almost proudly. Honestly, this setup turned out beautifully, don't you think? I looked around slowly. The gray walls. The tiny windows. The carefully designed separation. It's comfortable, I said. That's what matters at this stage. At this stage. I noticed then that Vanessa never used words like home or family anymore when speaking to me. Only practical words. Comfortable. Safe. Manageable. Like I was slowly becoming a medical condition instead of a person. She leaned against the doorway and smiled politely. I know change can be emotional for older people. Older people. Not Martha. Not family. Just older people. I studied her quietly for several seconds. Vanessa was beautiful in the polished way expensive women often are. Perfect nails. Perfect teeth. Hair that never moved out of place. But for the first time, I saw something underneath all that polish. Calculation. Everything with her was strategic. Even kindness. Especially kindness. Then she said something that made my stomach turn cold. We're really trying to build a future here. A future. Not our future. Theirs. And suddenly, I understood the real problem. I was never supposed to belong in this house permanently. I was simply the bridge that paid for it. Once they crossed safely to the other side, the bridge itself became inconvenient. Vanessa smiled one last time and headed back upstairs. Halfway up the steps, she paused. Oh, and Ethan mentioned we may have a financial advisor stopping by next week regarding the refinance paperwork. She said it casually, like I was too old to understand what that actually meant. Then she disappeared upstairs again. I sat frozen for a long moment after she left. Refinance paperwork. They were moving faster than I realized. And deep down, a terrifying thought began forming in my mind. If they succeeded in borrowing against the house, they could leave me with nothing at all. The next morning, I started pretending. Pretending everything was normal. Pretending I believed Vanessa's sweet little explanations. Pretending I didn't know they were trying to refinance the house behind my back. At 68 years old, I discovered something surprising about myself. I was very good at pretending. Maybe because women from my generation spent decades doing exactly that. Pretending not to notice disrespect. Pretending exhaustion wasn't swallowing us whole. Pretending sacrifice was the same thing as love. So when Vanessa smiled at breakfast the next morning and asked, "Did you sleep better?" I smiled right back. "Much better, thank you." Ethan barely looked up from his phone. The guilt was starting to show on him now. Not enough to stop lying, but enough to make eye contact uncomfortable. I quietly poured myself coffee while listening to them discuss backsplash samples and patio furniture. Thousands of dollars worth of upgrades for a house they'd practically stolen from me already. Vanessa suddenly turned toward me with artificial brightness. "Oh, Martha, we forgot to mention something exciting." I waited calmly. The refinance could actually free up enough money for Ethan to finally launch his own business. There it was. The real reason. Not medical bills. Not family security. Opportunity. My retirement savings were becoming startup capital. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "It's still early discussions." "What kind of business?" I asked softly. "A home automation company," he replied quickly, almost relieved I sounded supportive. "Smart security systems, custom installations, there's huge demand in Texas right now." I nodded slowly. Frank used to say ambition becomes dangerous when it grows faster than integrity. At the time, I thought he meant strangers. I never imagined he meant our own son. Later that afternoon, I drove back to Daniel Mercer's office. This time, I brought every piece of paperwork I could find. Printed emails, text messages, bank records, even handwritten notes Ethan had left during the buying process. Daniel spent nearly 2 hours reviewing everything carefully. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Martha," he said quietly, "this is better than I expected." My pulse quickened slightly. There are repeated written statements implying shared residency and lifetime security, he explained. That matters. But my name still isn't on the deed. No, he agreed. But intent matters in civil court, especially involving elderly financial exploitation. The word exploitation made me flinch, because hearing it from a lawyer suddenly made everything real. Daniel continued carefully. And the refinance may actually work in your favor. I frowned. How? If they formally declare ownership percentages or financial obligations during underwriting, they create documentation. Documentation. Proof. The very thing dishonest people hate most. For the first time in days, a small sense of calm entered my chest. Not hope exactly, but clarity. Daniel folded his hands together. I need to ask something. Difficult, Martha. I nodded slowly. If this becomes legal, are you emotionally prepared for what it could do to your relationship with Ethan? That question hurt more than all the paperwork combined, because despite everything, part of me still loved my son so deeply it felt physical. I thought about Ethan at age 9 falling asleep on Frank's shoulder during long road trips. I thought about his high school graduation, his wedding day, the first time he called me crying after losing his job years ago. And now here we were, a lawyer discussing my son like an opposing party. My eyes burned suddenly. I don't want revenge, I whispered. Daniel's expression softened. Then what do you want? The answer came surprisingly fast. I want them to stop treating me like I'm already gone. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Then Daniel nodded slowly. That, he said quietly, is a very reasonable thing to fight for. That evening, I returned home carrying copies of every document neatly organized inside a plain brown folder. As I entered through the garage, I heard excited voices upstairs again. Vanessa was talking loudly on speakerphone. Once the loan closes, everything changes for us, she laughed. I stopped cold near the staircase. Then I heard the sentence that made my blood run cold all over again. And honestly, Ethan's mother won't even understand what's happening until it's done. I stood frozen near the staircase, my hand still resting on the garage door handle. Upstairs, Vanessa continued laughing into her phone like she hadn't just destroyed something inside me. And honestly, Ethan's mother won't even understand what's happening until it's done. The words echoed in my chest long after she stopped speaking. For a moment, I couldn't move. Not because I was shocked anymore. That stage had already passed. No, this feeling was different. It was the terrible clarity that comes when someone finally says out loud exactly what they think of you. Weak, old, easy to manipulate. I quietly stepped back before they noticed I was home. Then I sat inside my car in the garage for several minutes with the engine off and my hands folded tightly in my lap. Frank used to tell me something whenever life became painful. When people think you're powerless, Martha, they stop hiding who they are. I understood that now. Vanessa believed I was already defeated. And Ethan, God help me, Ethan was letting her believe it. That night at dinner, I acted exactly the same as always. I complimented Vanessa's roasted chicken. I asked Ethan about work. I smiled in the appropriate places. Meanwhile, the entire time, I watched them carefully. Once you stop viewing someone through love, you begin noticing details. Vanessa constantly controlled conversations without seeming obvious about it. She answered questions directed at Ethan before he could respond himself. She redirected topics whenever finances came up. Even the way she touched his arm felt strategic, like gentle steering. And Ethan? He looked exhausted. Not guilty exactly. Cornered. There's a difference. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa casually placed a folder on the table. Oh good, she said brightly. You're both here. My stomach tightened instantly. Ethan avoided my eyes. Vanessa opened the folder and slid several papers toward him. The lender needs updated signatures before Friday. Lender. There it was again. I kept my face calm while cutting a piece of chicken slowly. What lender? I asked softly. Vanessa smiled politely, but I noticed a flicker of irritation pass through her eyes. The refinance company. So it's moving forward already? Hopefully, she replied smoothly. Interest rates are shifting, so timing matters. Timing. Everything with Vanessa sounded like a business presentation. Ethan finally spoke quietly. It could really help us financially, Mom. Us. Always us now. Never you and me. I set down my fork carefully. And what exactly does refinancing accomplish? Vanessa answered before Ethan could. It gives us flexibility, business capital, future investments, maybe private school eventually if we have children. I nodded slowly. All these dreams, built on my dead husband's savings. Then Vanessa looked directly at me and smiled in that sweet, dangerous way of hers. And of course, this house benefits everyone. Everyone. I almost admired how effortlessly she lied. Before I could respond, Ethan suddenly cleared his throat. There's also another thing we should probably discuss. Something in his voice made my chest tighten. Vanessa leaned back calmly, like she already knew what was coming. Ethan rubbed his palms together nervously before speaking. We've been thinking long-term about space. Long-term. Another phrase people use before hurting you. I stayed silent. He swallowed hard. If we eventually have kids, we may need to convert part of the basement into additional living space. I stared at him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I asked quietly, where exactly would I go? Ethan looked away immediately. Vanessa answered instead. Well, there are wonderful senior communities nearby. Senior communities. Not home. Not family. Storage. That's what they were discussing now. Where to relocate me once they fully extracted everything they needed. And suddenly, something surprising happened inside me. The pain began cooling into something else. Not grief. Not heartbreak. Calculation. I looked down at the refinance folder still sitting on the table. Then I noticed something important. One page had a company logo at the top. And beneath it, a loan officer's direct phone number. Vanessa must have assumed I was too distracted or too old to notice. She was wrong. Very wrong. Because while they sat there planning my future like I was already disappearing, I had just found the first thread capable of unraveling everything. That night, I waited until I heard the upstairs lights go off before making my move. The house became very quiet after midnight. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator upstairs and the occasional creak of settling wood. Funny how silence feels different once trust disappears. Every sound suddenly carries weight. I sat at the little basement table with my reading glasses on and stared at the loan officer's phone number I'd quietly memorized earlier during dinner. For several minutes, I simply looked at it. Not because I was afraid, because part of me still couldn't believe I had reached this point with my own child. Then I remembered Vanessa's voice. She won't even understand what's happening until it's done. Something hardened inside me after that. At exactly 8:15 the next morning, after Ethan left for work and Vanessa drove to Pilates, I made the call. The woman who answered sounded cheerful and professional. Good morning, Silver Oak Lending. This is Melissa. I kept my voice calm. Hello, Melissa. My name is Martha Whitaker. I believe my son and daughter-in-law are currently working with your office regarding a refinance application. A brief pause. Yes, ma'am. I have a question regarding the property involved. Her tone shifted slightly into cautious professionalism. Are you listed on the loan, ma'am? Interesting question. Not are you family. Not did you contribute financially. Only whether I officially existed on paper. No, I replied softly. But I provided the majority of the purchase funds for the home. Silence. Then keyboard typing. Well, Melissa said carefully. The current application lists the property as solely owned by Ethan and Vanessa Whitaker. Owned. Such a clean word for theft wrapped in paperwork. I thanked her politely and ended the call before my voice could betray me. Then I immediately called Daniel. She confirmed it. I said quietly once he answered. They're actively moving forward. Daniel didn't sound surprised. Martha, listen carefully to me, he said. Do not confront them yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. Because if they realize you're aware of the refinance, they may start moving assets or changing documentation faster. The calmness in his voice steadied me. For now, he continued, we gather evidence. Evidence. I was beginning to hate that word almost as much as gift contribution. Still, I understood now that emotions meant nothing in situations like this. Only proof mattered. That afternoon, I started paying attention to everything. Every conversation. Every document left carelessly on counters. Every change in behavior. And once I stopped trusting them, I noticed far more than I expected. Vanessa spent hours online shopping for furniture and luxury appliances while simultaneously complaining about financial pressure. Ethan barely spoke to me unless Vanessa was nearby, and both of them became strangely secretive anytime mail arrived. 3 days later, another clue appeared. I came upstairs early one morning and found a stack of printed documents sitting near the kitchen island beside Vanessa's laptop. Most people probably would have walked right past them, but I noticed numbers immediately. Projected loan amount. Estimated equity withdrawal. My chest tightened. They were trying to pull nearly $300,000 out of the house, almost the exact amount I contributed. I heard footsteps upstairs and quickly looked away just before Vanessa entered the kitchen. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't warmth anymore. It was management. "Morning, Martha," she said sweetly. "Could you do me a favor and sign for a package later if it arrives?" I smiled back just as sweetly. Of course. For one brief second, our eyes locked, and I realized something chilling. Vanessa still believed she was the smartest person in the room. That confidence was becoming her weakness, because while she and Ethan kept planning a future financed by my sacrifice, Daniel Mercer had already started building a case, and they had no idea how much trouble they were actually in. A week later, Vanessa announced they were hosting a housewarming party. Not a small dinner, a full party. Caterers, champagne, string lights across the backyard. She moved through the house like a woman preparing a magazine photo shoot instead of a family gathering. Meanwhile, I stayed downstairs organizing copies of documents for Daniel. Every day brought new evidence. Emails, loan estimates, messages discussing future space planning. The more I saw, the calmer I became. That surprised me. I always thought betrayal would feel explosive. But real betrayal is quieter than people imagine. It slowly removes your illusions one by one until all that's left is truth. And the truth was simple. My son and his wife had built an entire future around my silence. The afternoon before the party, Ethan knocked softly on the basement door. I looked up from my paperwork. For a second, he just stood there awkwardly. God, he looked tired. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkled dress shirt. The same nervous habit of rubbing his hands together he'd had since childhood. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. "Hi, sweetheart." That word still came naturally to me. Even now, he glanced around the basement like he suddenly realized how small it actually was. "You settling in okay down here?" "Down here. Not your room. Not your space. Down here." "I'm fine," I replied calmly. He nodded, but his eyes avoided mine. Then he cleared his throat. "Vanessa wanted me to mention something about tomorrow." Of course she did. "The party starts at 6, he continued. "Some business contacts are coming, and a few potential investors too." "Investors? Interesting. And?" I asked softly. He hesitated. "She thought it might be easier if you mostly stayed downstairs during the event." There it was, finally said out loud. Not hidden beneath sweet smiles or polite language. Hidden people should remain hidden. I stared at my son quietly. He looked deeply uncomfortable now. "She just means the house may get crowded," he added quickly. "Too much noise and activity." I almost smiled. When people lie badly, they always add too many explanations. "I understand," I said gently. Relief flooded his face so quickly it nearly broke my heart. "Thanks, Mom." Then he left. Just like that. No apology. No shame strong enough to stop him. Only relief that I continued making their betrayal easy. That evening, I sat alone downstairs thinking about the little boy Ethan used to be. When he was 7, he once cried for an entire afternoon because he accidentally stepped on a bird's nest in our backyard. Frank had held him afterward and said, "A good man protects vulnerable things." Where had that boy gone? Or maybe the more painful question was this: had he ever truly existed at all? The next evening, luxury cars filled the driveway before sunset. Laughter echoed through the upstairs rooms. Music drifted through the vents into the basement. I remained downstairs exactly as requested. Not because I was weak, because Daniel had advised patience. People reveal the most about themselves when they believe they've already won, he told me earlier that week. So I listened. Through the ceiling, I could hear Vanessa giving tours of the house. The open-concept kitchen sold us immediately. We designed most of the interior ourselves. This home represents the future we're building together. Together. Such an interesting word when spoken by people standing inside someone else's sacrifice. Around 8:30, I quietly walked halfway upstairs, just enough to see into the living room unnoticed. The house glowed beautifully under warm lighting. Guests held wine glasses while complimenting the marble counters and vaulted ceilings. Vanessa stood in the center of it all wearing a cream-colored dress, smiling like a queen presenting her kingdom. And Ethan stood beside her nodding proudly. Then one of the guests asked a question that made the entire room suddenly still. "So where's Ethan's mother staying now?" A tiny pause followed. Barely noticeable, but I saw it. Vanessa smiled politely before answering. "Oh, she's downstairs." "Downstairs? Not living with us?" Not part of the family. Just downstairs. Then she laughed softly and added the sentence that changed everything. It's actually the perfect setup until we decide what's best long-term. And at that exact moment, someone quietly stepped up beside me near the staircase. Daniel Mercer, holding a leather folder in his hands. Daniel stood beside me near the staircase, calm as ever in his gray suit and old-fashioned tie. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply listened. Upstairs, guests laughed while Vanessa continued showing off the house I paid for. The backyard sold us instantly, she was saying brightly. It just felt like the perfect place to build our future. Daniel glanced toward the living room. She has confidence, he murmured quietly. I gave a small, tired smile. She thinks I'm powerless. He looked at me carefully then. Good, he said softly. That makes this easier. My pulse quickened slightly. Even after everything, confrontation still frightened me. Not because I doubted the truth. Because public humiliation changes families forever. Daniel seemed to sense my hesitation. Martha, he said gently, you can still walk away tonight if you want. I thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked into the brightly lit living room where my son stood accepting compliments beside his wife while pretending I barely existed. No, I whispered. I think I'm done walking away. Daniel nodded once. Then together, we climbed the remaining stairs. Nobody noticed us at first. The party was in full swing now. Soft jazz music played through hidden speakers. Caterers moved through the kitchen carrying trays of champagne and appetizers. Vanessa stood near the fireplace telling a group of guests about Ethan's future business plans. Once the refinance closes, things should move very quickly, she said confidently. That sentence alone caused Daniel's eyebrow to lift slightly. Interesting, his expression seemed to say. Then one of the guests noticed me. Oh, there she is, the woman smiled politely. We were just asking about you. Vanessa turned. The moment she saw Daniel beside me, her smile flickered. Just slightly. But enough. Ethan noticed too. And suddenly, all the color drained from his face. And Mom, he stammered. What's going on? Daniel answered before I could. Good evening, he said calmly. I'm Daniel Mercer, family attorney for Martha Whitaker. The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She laughed softly and crossed her arms. Well, this seems dramatic. Daniel remained perfectly calm. I apologize for the timing, he replied, though he clearly didn't mean it. However, recent financial actions regarding this property made immediate clarification necessary. Now guests were openly staring. The music still played softly in the background, but conversation throughout the room had nearly stopped. Ethan stepped forward quickly. Mom, can we maybe discuss this privately? I looked at my son, really looked at him, at the fear in his eyes, at the panic finally replacing all that comfortable confidence. And for the first time in weeks, I realized something important. He knew exactly what they had done. Every bit of it. Daniel calmly opened the leather folder in his hands. Over the past several weeks, he said clearly, my client discovered that approximately $380,000 contributed toward this home purchase was categorized legally as a gift without her informed understanding. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vanessa's smile disappeared completely now. Daniel continued. Additionally, refinancing attempts are currently underway to extract substantial equity from the property, while the original financial contributor resides in the basement under increasingly unstable living assurances. The silence in that room became almost painful. One man near the kitchen quietly lowered his wine glass. Vanessa suddenly laughed sharply. This is ridiculous. But her voice sounded thinner now, less polished. Daniel removed another document from the folder. Actually, he said calmly, what's ridiculous is attempting financial restructuring before ensuring no elder exploitation concerns exist. The word exploitation hit the room like broken glass. Ethan immediately stepped forward. Mom, please, he whispered urgently. This isn't necessary. Necessary. Interesting word. I thought about the basement. The lies. The humiliation. The plans to move me into a senior facility after draining equity from the home my husband and I spent our lives paying toward. Then I looked directly at my son and asked the question I had carried in my chest for weeks. When exactly were you planning to tell me I no longer belonged here? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. And beside him, for the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa finally looked afraid. The room stayed silent after my question. When exactly were you planning to tell me I no longer belonged here? Nobody moved. Nobody even picked up a drink. The entire party had transformed from celebration to something painfully raw in less than 2 minutes. Ethan stood frozen near the fireplace, his face pale under the warm lighting. And Vanessa? She looked furious now. Not embarrassed. Not ashamed. Furious that control was slipping away. That's not what this is, Ethan finally said weakly. I looked at him quietly. Then explain it to me. He opened his mouth again, but Vanessa stepped in before he could answer. Martha, you are blowing this completely out of proportion. Her polished voice had changed now. Sharper. Colder. Daniel remained beside me. Without speaking, Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You offered to help us buy this house. I offered to build a home together. That's basically the same thing. No, I said softly. It isn't. The room grew even more uncomfortable. A woman near the dining area slowly set down her champagne glass. Nobody wanted to leave now. People are drawn to truth the same way they're drawn to storms. Vanessa laughed once, but there was panic underneath it now. You've lived here for months rent-free. Rent-free. That word hit harder than I expected. After everything Frank and I sacrificed. After every overtime shift. Every delayed vacation. Every dollar saved instead of spent. Rent-free. I saw Daniel glance at me carefully, almost checking whether I was okay. Oddly enough, I was. Because once someone reveals who they truly are, confusion disappears. Pain remains, but confusion leaves. Ethan suddenly stepped forward. Vanessa, stop. The room went still again. His wife turned toward him slowly. What? I said stop. For the first time all evening, Ethan looked directly at me. Really looked at me. And I think something finally broke inside him too. Not pride. Denial. His voice sounded smaller when he spoke again. Mom, I never wanted things to get like this. I almost smiled sadly. That's the thing about betrayal. Nobody admits they planned it. They simply keep making selfish decisions until the damage becomes irreversible. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. But you let it happen. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Vanessa stepped closer to him, anger flashing across her face now. Oh my God, are you serious right now? She snapped. You're acting like we committed some crime. Daniel finally spoke again. Well, he said calmly, the courts may eventually decide that question. That changed everything. Vanessa's confidence cracked visibly for the first time. You can't be threatening us in our own home. Our own home. Interesting phrase considering whose money built it. Daniel remained perfectly composed. No threats, Mrs. Whitaker. Only clarification. Then he removed one final document from the folder. I've already prepared formal notice requesting suspension of all refinance activity pending legal review. Ethan's face drained completely. Vanessa looked genuinely shaken now. What? She whispered. Daniel handed the document toward Ethan. Any further attempts to leverage equity connected to disputed financial contributions could create substantial legal exposure. Legal exposure. Such clean professional words for what this really was. Greed. Pure greed. Vanessa grabbed the papers from Ethan's hands and scanned them rapidly. This is insane, she snapped. She's family. I stared at her for several long seconds before answering. That stopped mattering to you the moment you moved me into the basement. The silence afterward felt enormous. And then something happened that nobody expected. Ethan started crying. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quiet tears sliding down the face of a grown man who finally understood what he had become. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words nearly destroyed me. Because part of me had waited weeks to hear them. But another part already knew something painful. An apology doesn't erase intention. Vanessa looked at him in disbelief. You're apologizing to her? Her. Not your mother. Her. And in that exact moment, Ethan finally saw what I had seen for weeks. Not just manipulation. Contempt. Cold, polished contempt hidden beneath years of perfect smiles. He stepped away from Vanessa slowly. And for the first time since I arrived in Texas, my son looked ashamed of the woman standing beside him. I moved out 3 weeks later. Not because they forced me to. Because I finally understood something that took me nearly 70 years to learn. A house means nothing if peace doesn't live inside it. Daniel handled everything carefully after the party. Once the refinance process was formally challenged, lenders immediately backed away until ownership disputes could be reviewed. That alone changed the atmosphere inside the house completely. The confidence vanished. The laughter upstairs stopped. And suddenly Ethan and Vanessa began avoiding each other almost as much as they avoided me. Funny how quickly partnerships crack once money becomes uncertain. For several days after the party, Ethan kept trying to speak with me privately. Sometimes he'd wait outside the basement door. Sometimes he'd catch me in the kitchen while Vanessa was upstairs. Every conversation started the same way. "Mom, I'm sorry." And every time, I believed he meant it. That was the tragic part. My son wasn't evil. Weakness made him dangerous long before cruelty did. There's a difference. Weak people allow terrible things because confronting them feels uncomfortable. Strong people protect others even when it costs them something. Frank understood that. I'm not sure Ethan ever truly did. Vanessa, however, never apologized once. Not sincerely. Oh, she attempted strategic apologies after the lawyers became involved. But those weren't apologies. They were negotiations wearing makeup. One afternoon, she cornered me in the kitchen while Ethan was out meeting with Daniel. "We can still fix this," she said tightly. I looked at her over my coffee cup. "Fix what exactly?" Her jaw flexed slightly. "This misunderstanding." I almost laughed. After everything, she still called it a misunderstanding. Like accidentally ordering the wrong paint color. Not systematically removing an elderly widow from the home she financed. "You wanted me gone," I said quietly. "That's not fair." "No," I replied calmly. "What you did wasn't fair." For once, she had no polished response ready. A week later, Daniel helped negotiate a settlement. The legal details were complicated, but the outcome was simple. I recovered a significant portion of the equity connected to my contribution. Enough to leave. Enough to start over. Enough to reclaim something far more important than money. My independence. The morning I moved out, Ethan carried my final suitcase to the car himself. Neither of us spoke much. What can a son really say after breaking his mother's heart for financial convenience? At the trunk, he finally looked at me with tears in his eyes. I never thought things would go this far. I believed him. That's the tragedy of selfishness. People rarely imagine consequences until they arrive. I touched his cheek gently the same way I used to when he was little. "I know," I said softly. Then his face crumpled completely. "Mom, please, don't disappear from my life." That nearly broke me. Because despite everything, part of me still saw the little boy holding Frank's hand beside Lake Texoma all those years ago. But love without boundaries destroys people. Especially mothers. "I'm not disappearing," I told him quietly. "But things can't go back to what they were." He nodded slowly, crying harder now. Behind the front window, I could see Vanessa watching us from inside the house. Alone. By the end of that summer, I bought a small cottage outside Fort Worth. Nothing extravagant. Just 2 bedrooms, a white porch swing, and enough garden space for tomatoes and roses. For the first time in years, the home felt peaceful. No whispering upstairs. No careful exclusions. No feeling like I was slowly being erased inside someone else's future. Sometimes Ethan calls now. Not as often as before, but differently. More honestly. Pain changes people when they allow it to. As for Vanessa, last I heard, the marriage was struggling badly after the refinance collapsed and the business plans fell apart. I don't celebrate that. Bitterness is its own kind of prison. But I do believe people eventually live inside the consequences they create. And as for me, I paid for their dream house. But in the end, leaving it behind was the first thing I'd truly done for myself in decades.